Hello everyone. This is a brief video walkthrough of some things that might be useful as you create the outline for the fear essay. If you've already read the lessons and materials in Blackboard related to the outline, you know that it's simply a plan for the writing of the paper itself. It provides you a step-by-step roadmap, if you will, for the points that you will have, the examples that you will use, and the approach that you will take to write the paper. So I want to show you a few things. These are just kind of a brief overview of some things that are explained in much greater detail in the notes that are in Blackboard. But the very first and the most important thing for the outline is that you have a good and viable working thesis statement. Some students had issue with their working thesis in the annotated bibliography, and that's okay. That's part of the purpose of the annotated bibliography, is to give me an opportunity to take a look at your thesis first and foremost, and if I notice any problems, to make recommendations so that you can revise it before you get to the outline. Because when you create the outline, if your thesis is problematic, then everything that you do in the outline will also be problematic, because the thesis is the point that you are trying to prove in the paper. It's the backbone of the paper. So if there's a problem with that, everything else will sort of fall apart. So if I made that comment on your annotated bibliography that your thesis needed to be revised, you need to do that first and make sure that it fits in with the parameters of the assignment. Now, the assignment gives 3 choices. 2 of the choices are provided by me. I give you a direct prompt, and that prompt provides you a fairly easy way of coming up with a thesis. So if you are struggling, if you did have trouble, I do recommend that you consider choosing prompts 1 or 2 simply because they are easier to work with, because I have provided the underlying framework for a question, the answer of which will provide your working thesis. And the example that you see here on this rough outline that I've just barely begun follows the strategy, one of the strategies that I list in the notes for how to create an outline in Blackboard. But before we talk about that, let me just say a little bit about the thesis. Some students have chosen option 3, which is kind of the open-ended option for producing a thesis, but many students who chose that option ended up coming up with a sentence that is more factual in nature, and it's not something that truly fits the definition of a thesis statement. A thesis statement is the writer's claim or belief about the subject under discussion, but by definition, a thesis must have an element of debate to it. So it has to be something that is not just purely factual, that nobody could possibly disagree with in any form or fashion. If it's just a straight up fact, then it can't really be the basis for a thesis. That doesn't mean you couldn't write a paper over that theoretically, but it wouldn't be the kind of paper that we're writing in this class. And so for those students that are really wanting to do topic number 3, in many cases I provided examples of what a sample thesis would be that might fit into that category. Most everybody, I think, has chosen prompts 1 or 2. So for the basis of this example, I have chosen one of the already established prompts. So this one is in response to the prompt that presents the question of how we can overcome our fears. Many students have a working thesis related to this prompt that doesn't speak to how we can do that. Instead, many students are presenting a line that just says that we can overcome them. Well, that's not really in question, but it's really a hard thing to do. And the real question that people want to have answered is, well, how can we go about doing that? I think everybody knows that it is possible to overcome some of the fears that hold us back, But knowing that something's possible and then knowing specifically how to do it are two very different things. So your thesis needs to speak to the how. Now, what I have here is kind of a formulaic approach, but for the purpose of the rough outline and even for the purpose of the rough draft, it doesn't hurt. I can always clean this up, I can revise it, I can make it better later, but for right now, this is a perfectly fine thing to do. And it's even a fine thing to do in the final draft. And the great thing about this strategy right here is it already suggests a structure to the paper. So this method starts with, the first part of the prompt, we can overcome our fears by or through, and then you fill in the blanks with very specific things from the sources. You don't make it up on your own. The answers come from the sources. So what you have to do is you have to go through the sources and you have to ask yourself, well, in this one that I want to use, what is the specific strategy that they are using to overcome whatever fear that they are talking about? And you try to pin it down and think of a concise phrase or a descriptive little phrase that you could use to describe the techniques that you're going to include. And so just in this little brief example, what I'm doing is I have a rough outline here. I've got my working thesis at the top, and a rough outline just means one that has bullet points. It's not formal, and this right here is not complete. I've just started it because I'm explaining the process. I've got my thesis up here. We can overcome our fears through pretense, exposure therapy, and logical analysis. And I could have other blanks. This is just an example. I've just got 3 here to sort of illustrate. Now, one of the bullet points I have is a placeholder for the introduction, and I also have here at the bottom a placeholder for the conclusion. I'm going to flesh those out later, but right now I'm just putting them in the rough outline to remind myself that I need a plan for those sections as well. But I'm going to start with the middle part because this is going to be the vast majority of the paper, the body of the paper. So the things that I put in the big bullet points here, they need to match what I have in the thesis. So if I'm saying that one way is through pretense, then the very first thing I need to put here is overcoming fear through pretense. It matches there. So that ensures that when I get to that point in the paper, it's going to match with my thesis. It provides me with a structure for the paper. My second point or my second method is exposure therapy. So my next point that relates to my thesis is the process of overcoming fear through exposure therapy. And then the last one that I have is through logical analysis. So I'm going to put that here, overcoming fear through logical analysis. So that's the first step in creating your rough outline, putting your working thesis, putting the placeholders for the intro and the conclusion, and then putting in what your big points are. Now, before I move forward, I want to make a really important point. Even though right now in this little example I have 5 sections, that does not mean in the paper that I will have 5 paragraphs. The reality is that some, maybe all of these sections will take multiple paragraphs in order to develop. All I'm doing right now is I'm establishing what are my main big points that relate to my thesis, and I've got those 3 points there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go through here and put the various sources that I'm going to use in each section, or that I can use in each section. So for overcoming fear through pretense, I know I can use Class Act and the Amy Cuddy TED Talk. For overcoming fear through exposure therapy, I know I can include the Jia Zhang TED Talk, and I could also include Chris Hadfield, and it also has, kind of applicability to this one, and it's got very specific links to Ted Ferriss's TED Talk, specifically, really both of them, but I think the one that I have in mind here is probably the one about overcoming your fears, or not overcoming, but his TED Talk about defining your fears instead of your your goals, but I could use his other TED Talk as well. And then I'm also going to use Superfluous Torment. Now, as I count these up, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've got 6 sources here, but one problem I have in my outline is that I only have 2 print sources right now, and the assignment sheet says I have to have at least 3. So even though I've got 6, I can totally use these. I can have extra, but I need to make sure that I am meeting the minimum requirements for the actual essay. All of the things that we do in a given unit are related to the essay. So the rules for the essay are the same rules that apply to the things that are leading up for the essay. You need the same amount of sources. If there are any restrictions or special requirements, then we need to make sure that that is kind of factored into the outline or the annotated bibliography or whatever aspect of the process that we are focusing on. I think for the logical analysis one, I think I would also like to use, and I'm going to put it down here at the bottom for right now, because maybe I don't know where I want to use it at this point. I want to use 10 ways we get the odds wrong. So let me type that out. Okay, so I'm going to use that. So that's going to be my third source. So now, even though I've got 7 sources, I'm at least meeting the requirement of having 3 print sources. Now I have to figure out where I want to put this. Now, obviously, I can put it here because that's where it applies. It doesn't really apply here to exposure therapy or through pretense. So I may just put it right here for now, but there are also things that I could use from this source to establish some background. So it may be something that I actually end up moving to after the introduction, but I'm going to put this right here for right now. So now all I've done is I have established what my main points are and kind of figured out, well, which sources are going to give me some material that I could use to show how we can overcome fear through pretense. So now what I have to do for each of the points and each of the sources is I have to go through and figure out what points do I want to pull out of these sources to put underneath here. So I'm not going to leave this here as just the listing of the sources. I'm going to go back at some point and replace these things or put things underneath them. So what I could do, for example, is, I can do this and I could put, well, what are the points? What are the examples that I want to put for class act? And I'm going to fill those in with little bullet points. And I'm going to do the same with Amy Cuddy, and I'm going to do this for all of the sources that I have here. Now, while I'm doing that, it's very likely that I may end up deciding to move things around. So for instance, I may decide that when I'm making this point, maybe I want to bring in things from the Amy Cuddy TED Talk first. And so I may take this and I may cut it, and I may decide to paste all of whatever I'm going to put, right there before class act. So the nice thing about a rough outline is if I decide to move something around, I can cut and paste and move. Or if I make a mistake somewhere or I change my mind and I decide, you know what, I'm going to use this Chris Hadfield talk and I'm going to talk about it, here in this section. Or maybe I decide to talk about it a little bit in this section and continue that in the beginning part of the next one. And one of the reasons that I might want to do that is because the Hadfield TED Talk does have some things in there that tie into and have examples of, exposure therapy, but it also has things that tie into the things that I would talk about here about overcoming fear through logical analysis. The rough outline also allows me to identify problems or inconsistencies in my plan, and I can easily cut, paste, move things around, delete things, add things. So it's pretty easy to do. It's almost like being in a sandbox or whatever. It gives you a way to kind of play around with your approach. And later, I'm also going to consider, what order do I want to put these in? Now, I do have to, when I have a thesis that's structured like this, I need to put them in the order that they appear in the sentence. So I have to put pretense, exposure therapy, and logical analysis for right now. But as I'm thinking about which ones are most beneficial for me to talk about first, second, third, fourth, and so on, I may decide later that I don't want to talk about this one first. Maybe I want to talk about logical analysis first, and maybe I want to leave this one for last, because these are very systematic approaches for overcoming a fear, and this one isn't so much systematic as it is a way to work or do what you need to do in spite of being fearful. And so it's not initially a way of overcoming fear. There's an initial way of kind of invoking the pretense of fearlessness while you're doing something so that you gain more practice at it, so that you get better at it. And so it also has tie-ins with this notion of exposure therapy as well. So I'm also getting ideas of what I might want to place where, and that's going to be a good thing for me to think about, because in my paper, I need to think about how am I going to transition from the point I'm making here to the next one and so on. So the order in which I present things and the connections that I can see between the various things and the different sources will help me figure out the best order to put things in, not only within a section, but also the order to put my main sections in. And so the idea is that when you create an outline, you always start with this process first, with the rough outline, so that you can just kind of sketch it out and then you flesh it out. So what you see here is not complete at all. I'm just showing you how to start it out. You've got to go back in and you choose all the examples that you're going to use. You choose the points that you're going to make and so on. You move them around until you're satisfied with them, and the rough outline should make sense to somebody else once you're done with it and you give it to them. They should say, oh, okay, I see what you're doing. I see where you're going with this. I see the connection between what you have in your thesis and your big points. I see what examples you're going to use, and I see which sources you're going to use in a given section. So notice that the outline is organized point by point. It is not organized source by source. Sometimes what students have a tendency to want to do is they have a tendency to want to put a source here for the big point, and you don't do that. You put the point that you wish to prove, and the sources and the details from the sources and the things that you're going to add to that, they go underneath those points. And the reason why we do that is to get the basic plan. And oftentimes a rough outline, if it's good and if it's fleshed out, if it's totally complete, it's a perfectly good way to approach coming up with a plan. But if you want to come up with a truly detailed plan, then you do something like this. Now, this is one of the handouts that is present in the unit. And this is what you do after you've done a rough outline. You really flesh it out. You get all the details and the particulars. Now, it's important to point out that this is a partial outline. I didn't do the whole thing because I don't want students to copy from a complete outline that I have. I want you to have the experience of going through and putting together the outline yourself. Now, it is based on, the start of the rough outline that I just showed you. Notice that I have here, we can overcome some of our fears through pretense, exposure therapy, and logical analysis. So I have part of that fleshed out here. So notice I have my first big point, dealing with fear by pretense. That correlates to the first point that I had in the rough outline. And so here is a specific point that I have. The idea of facing our fears in action in spite of being fearful. And notice that I'm labeling out to the side when I'm using a given source. So here I'm putting the notion of feigning confidence as a means to achieving it for real. Put Roosevelt out to the side to remind myself and the teacher that I'm turning this into that, hey, I'm getting this idea from the Roosevelt source so that I can see for myself, if I'm writing this paper, and somebody else can too, what I'm using from a given source and what I might be adding to the mix on my own. Because ultimately, when the outlines are complete, They should have not only the things that you'll be using from the sources, but they should also have some indication of what you're going to contribute. Because when we write this paper, it's not just all summary of what the sources say. You have to do something with those sources, and you have to make a contribution. You won't be adding any personal experience, but you'll be connecting the dots, you'll be extending things, you'll be explaining, you'll be making a contribution to the outline as well. Now, what you cannot do, you can't do what I did right here. You can't put specific things go here. You actually have to put things there. I just did enough of this little partial outline to show you how you go from the rough outline to the formal outline. This is a formal Roman numeral outline. It's got rules and expectations in terms of how it looks, how it's formatted. Notice that the Roman numeral 1 is the introduction. Then you've got the A, B, C, D. Those line up under the I in introduction. And notice that the 1, 2, 3 under the hook and the 1 and 2 under the presentation of the issue, those line up under the first letter of the point that is expressed there. So it's got a very particular format, and things have to come in at least pairs. Every A must have a B, every 1 must have a 2, and that is just so that you make sure that you have enough things underneath a given point so that you can actually develop it. So you can't just have a 1 dangling by itself. You can't just have an A dangling by itself. And you can have as many numbers as you need, as many letters of the alphabet as you need for a given section. Keep in mind, this is very incomplete. And when you turn in your outline to me, you will not title it Sample Partial Outline. It's just going to be called, your FEAR outline, something like that, and it will be complete, and you will have a heading on yours. I did not put a heading on this one because it's just a handout. It's just an example. It's not an assignment that I'm doing to turn in, but you're doing this as an assignment to turn in to me. So notice here I have, some things here that indicate the plan for how I'm going to develop this point, showing how one of the ways we can overcome fear is, by using the method of pretense, kind of the fake it till you make it kind of thing. And then I've got another point here of dealing with fear through deliberate and repeated exposure. So this is the point that relates to exposure therapy. And notice that I'm using language that ties back into the thesis. So those of you who have a working thesis that doesn't have the blanks in it, that just kind of has a bigger umbrella under which things might go, you still need to have this level of specificity in your outline. So if you've got a broader thesis, you still have to have the specificity in the outline because you have to have it in the paper. So even for those students, it is a good exercise to use the blanks strategy where you say, we can overcome some of our fears by blank, 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 and blank. Or if you're choosing the one about what we can learn from our fears, doing the same thing where you say, we can learn blank, 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 and blank. So even as just a mental exercise of doing that, it forces you to identify either the lessons that are coming out of the sources that you've chosen, the lessons we can learn about fear, because those need to be articulated in the outline and in the paper, or you're identifying the specific strategies or techniques that are present in the sources that you have chosen. So that's why prompts 1 and 2 are particularly easy in terms of coming up with a thesis. And it's pretty easy to come up with a logical structure. Notice too that in the Roman numerals, just like in the rough outline, you will never ever put, next to the Roman number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, you'll never put body paragraph or body section. It will always be a point, and it will always be a point that relates to some aspect of your thesis. The only place where you ever put kind of a descriptive title, like, that would be the equivalent of that would be for the introduction and then for the conclusion. But notice in your outline and even in your rough outline, because remember, before you can do a formal outline, you really need to have a totally fleshed out rough outline, so that you've got your plan and you've worked out all the kinks and the bugs, and you've kind of corrected all the mistakes that you've made, and you will make them. I always do in my rough outlines as well, and that's the place where you can rearrange things and fix things before you get to this stage. So it's almost like putting together a jigsaw puzzle at Christmas, or those rainy days when the TV's out or whatever. It's not hard to do, but there's a lot of moving parts to it, and you've got to figure out what goes where and things like that. And so there's a system to it. And the first part of that system, let me go back to the rough outline. The first part of that is coming up with the big parts, the big pieces. So the equivalent of that when you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle is when you are kind of identifying the pieces with the edge on it, the pieces with the corners, so that you have the framework of the jigsaw puzzle. You do the framework first. You put the edges and the corners together, the frame of the picture, if you will, and then you flesh in the details after that. Then you put in the inside piece parts of the jigsaw puzzle. The same is true of the outline. You come up with the big parts first. These are the backbone of the paper, and then you go through and you start fleshing out the details completely and thoroughly in the rough outline, and then you rearrange it and make all your changes and revisions, and then you put it together in the pretty formal outline where you really have everything lined out. And the great thing about the outline is that if you do it right and you do it well, and if it's logical, and you'll know it's logical if it makes sense not only to you, but if you hand it to somebody else and it makes sense to them. They should be able to see the correlation, the connection, through the use of language and the structure of the outline. Pretense, exposure therapy, and then the last one is logical analysis. So we should see that through here. So that part is really easy. And then the rest is kind of putting the points, the examples, all of that, where they go in the outline, and making sure they're in a good order. If you do this, this makes the drafting of the paper much, much easier, and it makes it much less likely that you'll have to rewrite your paper in its entirety for the second draft. There's no big deal if you have to do that. That's why we do 3 drafts for all the papers that we do in here. Always the first draft is just, try your best, get it complete. And if we have this outline in place, and ideally if you have a set of notes, if you have a good set of notes that are taken the way they're supposed to and a good outline, then that's the real hard part. And those things aren't actually hard to do. They just take a little bit of time. But if you do those things, and if the outline makes sense, then the drafting should be the fastest part of the process, and ultimately the easiest part if you have processed the sources thoroughly. And if you don't do that, and if you write without an outline, you run the risk of having a paper that is problematic in one or more ways, and that has to be rewritten in its entirety. So all of the ideas behind this legwork is to minimize the amount of work that you have to do later. Now, we are going to have a lot of work to do in terms of revising a paper, because there's always opportunity for improvement. But if we can avoid having to rewrite a rough draft in its entirety, that's a good thing. And one of the ways that we can do that is by making sure that we have a clear, logical structure, that we make all the decisions ahead of time about what we're going to use, what examples, from which sources, all that kind of stuff, before we sit down to write the paper. If you've got a good outline and a good set of notes, and even if you just have a good outline and you've got your articles annotated, that should go a long way into making the draft much, much easier to do and making it much more successful than it might have been otherwise. The most important thing, though, to think about before you begin on the outline is making sure your thesis is viable. So do make sure that you looked at my comments and that you identified whether or not I said you're good to go, you're good to start doing the outline, or whether I recommended that you revise your thesis first before you do that. Because again, if your thesis is off, the whole outline will be off. And that's not a big deal either, because you can always go back and redo your outline before you draft. But if you take the time to try to make it work the first time, even if the outline's not perfect, that's okay. But it does need to provide the basic structure, and it does need to provide you some guidance in terms of how you're going to approach each section. All right, so this is what we're aiming for in terms of the assignment for the outline. Now, when you read the instructions for turning in the assignment, I'm actually going to give you an option. This is the kind of outline that I always ask for, the formal outline, but I'm going to give you two options. I'm going to give you the option of either choosing to turn in a rough outline, and that will be the one with the bullet points, or the formal outline. The only caveat to that is that if you're doing just the rough outline, you can earn up to an 88 on that if it's detailed and if it's fleshed out. For you to be eligible for full credit, I'll ask you to go ahead and go the extra mile and do a formal outline. But again, it needs to be complete. I think some people are looking at some of the examples that I have, and they're like, oh, Ms. Bell only had 2 entries in her annotated bibliography, so I only need 2. And that's not true. In the notes for the annotated bibliography, I explained that. I explained that that was just I did 2 entries. I didn't want to do the whole thing because I didn't want students copying from me, because there aren't, that many sources. And if I choose 6 and I do a full one on that topic, it is likely that many students might have entries that are too derivative of mine, and they didn't really get the experience of doing that assignment on their own. So just keep in mind that whichever method you choose for the outline, do one or the other. And let me also just say, guys, that these are just homework assignments, and homework is very important. It's worth 20% of the grade, so you don't want to rack up zeros, and you do want to do your very best on them, but you shouldn't stress or agonize over, oh, I got an 88 on this instead of 100. It's just a homework grade. We're going to have lots and lots of these. The real chunk of your grade for this course comes from the main essays. For example, the FEAR essay that we're about to write, between the 2 rough drafts and the final drafts, that's worth 30% of your grade. So that one assignment and the 2 drafts associated with it, in fact, the final draft for the FEAR essays were 27% of the total grade. That one paper is worth more than all of the homework assignments that you will do over the entire 15, 16-week course. So the reason I'm giving you that option on the outline is that it is a little bit easier to do just the rough outline. And if you do a good job on it and it's detailed, you can still get a very high grade on it, and it still is very useful if it's logical in terms of helping you produce a paper. So I'm trying to help you out a little bit by giving you an easier option. So if you want to do that, because it'll be a little bit quicker to produce than this one, then by all means do that. If you get an 88 on a particular homework assignment, that is not going to be something that prevents you from getting an A or a B in the course. So I do want to put your mind at rest in terms of that. So the notes in the unit are more detailed than what I've said here, but I created a video for those that wish to watch this and to get some clarification, because some people may not be seeing the notes, or they may be looking at the notes and may still have questions, and perhaps this video might fill in the gaps, because maybe it feels a little bit more like what we would do if we were in a face-to-face class and I'm just kind of explaining the concepts to the class and showing you examples on the computer screen in the classroom. So I'll close this video for now, but this is the next order of business, and I would encourage you to do your very best on the outline, because if you do a good job on this, it will make your life easier when it comes time to drafting the paper. All right, so that's it. Y'all have a great day, great afternoon, great evening at whatever point you are encountering this video, and I will talk to you soon.